The cool, damp stone bit into his knees, a sharp contrast to the furnace of the air he had been breathing for 2 endless days. Before him, in a shallow, impossible pool cupped by the rock, his little sister Ruth drank with frantic, guttural gasps, her feverish skin already seeming less flushed. His brother Samuel, only 6 years old, plunged his entire face into the water, coming up sputtering and alive. The sound of their survival, of the clear water bubbling from a hidden fissure in the earth, was the only thing Elijah Miller could hear over the roaring in his own ears. He had followed the hawk, a solitary speck circling in an unforgiving sky, trusting a memory of his mother's voice, a ghost of a promise. Now, with his siblings safe for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the strength that had carried him across miles of sun-scorched earth finally broke. His 13-year-old body, pushed beyond every known limit of endurance, was racked with a single silent sob that tore up from the very depths of his soul, a release of terror and gratitude so profound it felt like shattering. This is a story about the kind of hope that finds you when all seems lost, and the invisible love that can guide you through the darkest of trials. If this moment has already found a place in your heart, we would be honored if you let us know where you are listening from in the comments below. Your presence here adds to the power of this narrative, and we invite you to subscribe and stay with us until the very end, because the journey to this hidden spring is one of survival, sacrifice, and a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. We believe every second of it is worth hearing, and we are grateful to share it with you today. But to understand how the flight of a single bird could represent a divine intervention, and why the simple sight of water could completely undo a boy who had refused to break, we must go back. This moment of desperate relief was not the beginning of their story, but the climax of a journey that started with a devastating loss. The 3 Miller children were not in the heart of the Sonoran Desert by accident. They were placed there by a calculated act of cruelty, abandoned and left for dead. To comprehend the depth of their ordeal and the miracle of their survival, we have to travel back 8 months, to the cold autumn day when their father's death left them in the sole, uncaring custody of their stepmother, a woman whose heart held a cruelty as vast and barren as the desert itself. 8 months before the miracle of the spring, the Miller home in Tucson was a house holding its breath. The initial raw grief that had followed their mother Sarah's death from cholera had been a shared burden, a fog that clung to every room but one they navigated together. When their father, Jacob, a man whose hands were as calloused from the silver mines as his heart was gentle, remarried Constance Harlow, a fragile hope had flickered. But the mine collapse that took Jacob just 4 months later didn't just extinguish that hope. It plunged the house into a new kind of darkness. This darkness was cold, deliberate, and had a name. Constance's respectable widow's facade, so carefully maintained in Jacob's presence, crumbled into dust, revealing a foundation of pure resentment. The house was no longer a home filled with sorrow, but a prison ruled by a silent, bitter warden who saw 3 children not as her family, but as living debts against her newfound inheritance. At the center of this cold new world was Elijah Miller. At 13, he was caught in the impossible space between boyhood and the crushing responsibilities of a man. The loss of his mother had carved a hollow space in his chest, and his father's death had filled it with a heavy, cold stone of duty. He no longer had the luxury of his own grief. Every morning he would wake, and his first thought was not of himself, but of Ruth and Samuel. He was their shield, their provider of comfort, their keeper of memories. He met Constance's icy stares with a carefully blank expression, learning to swallow his anger and fear because any sign of defiance would only bring harsher restrictions upon them all. He moved through the house with a quiet purpose, his young shoulders squared against a weight that would have broken most adults, driven by the fierce primal instinct to protect the only family he had left. The very air in the house had changed. Under his mother's care, it had smelled of baking bread, of dried herbs, and the faint, clean scent of soap. Now it carried the sterile odor of lye and the faint, musty smell of rooms kept perpetually shut. Sunlight seemed to struggle through the grimy window panes, illuminating dust motes dancing in the oppressive silence. The warmth from the hearth was gone, the fireplace left cold and black. Constance insisted on a level of quiet that was unnatural for a home with children. where a dropped spoon would earn a withering glare that lasted for hours. Elijah felt the cold seep not just into the floorboards, but into his very bones, a constant, chilling reminder that they were no longer welcome in the house their father had built for them. Every creak of the floor felt like an accusation, every shadow a threat. Their days became a predictable ritual of deprivation. Mealtimes were the most potent display of Constance's control. She would serve them watery stew or a single, thin slice of bread on chipped plates, while she herself ate from a separate, heartier meal. Her eyes would follow every bite they took, a silent accounting of the resources they were consuming. Elijah taught himself to eat with painstaking slowness, to make the meager portion last. He would often break off a piece of his own bread when Constance wasn't looking, palming it to slip to Samuel later, whose small stomach was a constant, aching complaint. The hunger was a dull, persistent ache, but it was the humiliation of the act, the deliberate, measured starvation, that truly gnawed at Elijah's spirit, stoking a fire of helpless rage deep within him. Constance's cruelty was a thing of quiet, methodical erosion. She never raised her voice, never laid a hand on them. Her weapon was neglect, a slow and steady erasure of their existence. After their morning meal, the children were often confined to their small, shared bedroom for hours on end, with no explanation given. She would lock the door from the outside, the sound of the bolt sliding home a definitive declaration of their status as prisoners. They were an ugly, loose end from her husband's previous life, and she was determined to keep them out of sight, to minimize their presence until they felt like ghosts in their own home. Their world shrank to the four walls of that room, a space that grew smaller and more stifling with each passing day, while the world outside their window went on without them. But within that locked room, a small pocket of resistance and love persisted. In the dim light, with the sounds of the house muffled and distant, Elijah became the parent. He would gather Ruth and Samuel on the single cot they shared, the springs groaning under their combined weight, and he would speak to them in a low, soothing whisper. He resurrected their mother's stories, tales of clever coyotes and resilient cacti, of the stars being the campfires of ancient ancestors. He would describe the taste of her apple pies so vividly that Samuel would lick his lips, a phantom sweetness on his tongue. These stories were more than a distraction. They were an act of defiance. In that room, Constance's cold reality could not penetrate the warmth of their shared memory, a fragile fortress built from their mother's words. These memories of his mother, Sarah, became Elijah's most precious possession. He would close his eyes and summon her face, the way her hands felt braiding Ruth's hair, the sound of her humming a hymn as she worked. He clung to her teachings, snippets of wisdom that now felt like prophecies. She had been born in the desert and understood its harsh language. She had taught him how to find north using the sun, how to identify edible plants, and, most importantly, how to watch the animals. She used to say that God left messages for those who were patient enough to read them, written in the flight of a hawk or the trail of a lizard. At the time, they were just fascinating lessons from a mother he adored. Now, lying in the dark, he hoarded these fragments of knowledge like a miser, sensing with a deep and unsettling certainty that they were the only true inheritance his parents had left him. He watched over his siblings with a vigilance that was heartbreaking. Ruth, at 10, was becoming withdrawn, her vibrant curiosity dimming under the weight of Constance's oppressive presence. She would sit for hours staring at a crack in the wall, her small hands clasped in her lap. She had stopped asking when their life would go back to normal. 6-year-old Samuel was too young to grasp the malice, but he understood its effects. He understood the constant hunger, the cold, and the fear that radiated from his older siblings. He would often wake from nightmares, crying silently into Elijah's shoulder. Elijah would hold him, stroking his hair and whispering promises of safety he had no way of keeping, feeling the sharp edges of his own helplessness with every tremor that ran through his little brother's body. The psychological warfare escalated one Tuesday in late July. The children were allowed out of their room to find a man in the parlor, carting away their father's favorite armchair, the one with the worn leather arms where he used to sit and read to them. Constance stood by the door, her arms crossed, her face a mask of indifference as she accepted a few coins from the man. She didn't look at them, didn't acknowledge the way Ruth's breath hitched or the way Elijah's hands clenched into fists at his sides. She was systematically dismantling their past, selling off the pieces of their parents' lives, erasing any evidence that this house had ever been a place of love. It was a clear and brutal message. You have nothing left here. Your history is worthless. A cold dread began to solidify in Elijah's gut. This was not a sustainable life. It was a slow, deliberate march towards an unknown, terrible end. He started listening more intently, trying to piece together Constance's plans from the scraps of conversation he could overhear. He heard her mention a property in Phoenix, talk of unfortunate attachments, and the need for a clean slate. The words were vague, but their intent was chilling. He knew with the unshakable certainty of an animal sensing a predator that Constance was not merely content to make them miserable. She was planning to dispose of them. The question was no longer if their situation would change, but how violent and final that change would be. The quiet oppression was a prelude, a slow tightening of a snare before the final, brutal snap. He began to observe Constance with a new, desperate focus, searching for any sign of what was to come. He noticed her studying a map of the territory late one night, her finger tracing a line eastward from Tucson into the vast, empty expanses of the Sonoran Desert. He saw her purchase 3 new canteens from the general store, a practical act that seemed utterly disconnected from their confined indoor lives. These small, disparate details began to connect in his mind, forming a terrifying picture. He didn't have a name for her plan, but he could feel its shape. It was a plan that involved a long journey, a final separation, and the unforgiving heat of the Arizona sun. The fear was no longer a vague anxiety. It was a sharp, specific terror that kept him awake at night, listening to the quiet breathing of his siblings and praying for a deliverance he could not yet imagine. The end of their passive suffering arrived not with a whisper, but with the violent shock of ice-cold water. On a blistering August morning, long before the sun had begun to bleach the color from the sky, Constance entered their room. She carried 2 buckets, and without a word doused them in their sleep. The frigid water was a brutal awakening, stealing the air from their lungs and leaving them gasping on the thin mattress. Elijah shot upright, his heart hammering against his ribs, not with fear, but with a sudden, chilling clarity. This was it. The waiting was over. The quiet war of attrition had just escalated into an open assault, and the cold dread he had been nursing for months instantly sharpened into the point of a knife held to his throat. The routine of neglect was broken, replaced by an act of such deliberate aggression that it could only be a prelude to something final. She offered no explanation, her face a blank mask of detached purpose as she ordered them to dress. Her voice was flat, devoid of the usual simmering resentment, now replaced by an unnerving mechanical efficiency. She led them from the room, their wet clothes clinging uncomfortably to their skin, and out into the pre-dawn gloom of the yard. There, hitched and ready, was the farm wagon. On the seat lay the 3 new canteens he had seen her buy, each only half filled. The disconnected pieces of his observation, the map, the canteens, her talk of a clean slate, slammed together in his mind, forming a picture so monstrous he could barely comprehend it. He understood then that Constance wasn't just planning to get rid of them. She had a specific, terrible method in mind, and its journey was beginning right now. Elijah was herded onto the back of the wagon with his siblings, the rough-hewn wood pressing into his back. He opened his mouth to ask where they were going, to voice any protest, but the look Constance gave him was not one of anger or irritation. It was a look of utter finality, a gaze that communicated he was no longer a person to her, but an object to be transported and discarded. The question died on his lips. He pulled Ruth and Samuel close, trying to shield them from the growing chill of the morning and the far greater chill of his own dawning terror. The wagon lurched forward, its wheels grinding against the dirt road, carrying them away from the only home they had ever known. They rode in silence, the only sounds the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves and the creak of the straining wood, each noise marking their progress toward an unknown, terrifying destination. For what felt like an eternity, they traveled east, away from the rising sun that was beginning to paint the horizon in shades of orange and red. The familiar silhouette of the Tucson mountains shrank behind them, replaced by a vast, featureless expanse of the Sonoran Desert. The landscape became an active participant in their ordeal, a sprawling, indifferent wilderness that seemed to swallow the narrow track of the road. Elijah watched as the saguaros grew more sparse, the earth more cracked and barren. The air, once cool, grew thick and heavy with the promise of a brutal day. He felt the heat beginning to press in on them, a physical manifestation of the closing trap. He knew with a certainty that settled like a stone in his stomach that they were being taken to a place from which no child could return on their own. The wagon rolled on for 6 hours, a punishing, monotonous journey under the climbing sun. Finally, in a place that looked no different from the miles of desolate land they had already crossed, Constance pulled the horse to a halt. There was nothing here, no sign of a settlement, no crossroads, not even a well. Just the shimmering heat rising from the baked earth and the buzz of unseen insects. The abrupt silence that descended when the wagon stopped was more deafening than any noise. It was a void, an absolute emptiness that mirrored the landscape around them. This, Elijah realized, was the destination. This place of nothingness was the end point of Constance's plan, a location chosen specifically for its hopelessness, a grave without the dignity of a marker. She disembarked from the driver's seat, her movements unhurried and precise. She handed each of them a canteen without meeting their eyes, her touch as impersonal as if she were handing out tools. Then she pointed a single, bony finger toward the eastern horizon, a shimmering line of heat and dust. Her voice, when it came, was as flat and dry as the desert floor. "There's a town 2 days' walk east," she said, the words hanging in the hot, still air. "If God wants you to live, you will." It was a declaration of abandonment cloaked in the thinnest veil of plausible deniability. She wasn't giving them a direction. She was giving them a death sentence, an impossible task designed to be failed, leaving their fate to the unforgiving elements and a God she clearly did not believe in. In that instant, a fire of pure, unadulterated rage ignited in Elijah's chest. He wanted to scream, to launch himself at her, to fight with the desperation of a cornered animal. The injustice of it was a physical force, a wave of heat that threatened to consume him. But then he felt a small hand slip into his. It was Ruth, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored his own. He looked down at Samuel, who was clutching his pant leg, too scared to even cry. The rage vanished, extinguished by the cold, immediate weight of his responsibility. He could not break, he could not fall apart. If he succumbed to his own fear and anger, they would be truly lost. His survival was no longer his own. It was intrinsically tied to theirs, and it depended entirely on him remaining their protector, their leader, their hope. Constance did not wait for a reaction. She turned her back on them, climbed onto the wagon, and with a sharp snap of the reins, urged the horse forward. She did not give them a final glance, no flicker of remorse or hesitation. She simply drove away, leaving the three of them standing alone in a swirling cloud of dust. They watched as the wagon became a smaller and smaller speck, its form wavering in the heat until it was finally swallowed by the horizon. The faint sound of its wheels faded, and then there was nothing. The silence of the desert rushed back in to fill the void, a profound and terrifying quiet that confirmed their absolute isolation. They had been erased from her life as easily as wiping a slate clean. The dust slowly settled around their feet, coating their clothes and skin with a fine, gritty layer. The sun, now high in the sky, beat down with a relentless, punishing force. For a long, stunned moment, the three Miller children did not move, frozen in place by the sheer, unbelievable reality of their situation. The vague threat that had haunted their days for months was no longer a fear of what might happen. It was here. It was the scorching ground beneath their boots, the rapidly warming water in their half-empty canteens, and the vast, empty wilderness that stretched out before them in every direction. Constance's methodical cruelty had reached its horrifying climax. This was not a punishment. It was an execution by exposure. They had been left to die. For a long, agonizing minute after the wagon vanished, Elijah did not move. He simply stood, a statue of dust and disbelief, the sun's rising heat already beginning to bake the dampness from his clothes. The silence was the most terrifying part. It was not the peaceful quiet of a country morning, but a profound, predatory emptiness that seemed to press in from all sides, a physical weight on his eardrums. In this vast, indifferent theatre of rock and sand, the only sound was the frantic, shallow breathing of his own lungs and the soft, confused whimper that escaped Samuel's lips. The world had just contracted to this single, hopeless point on the earth, and the sheer scale of their abandonment was a chasm that threatened to swallow him whole. He felt an irrational urge to scream, but the air was too thick, too heavy, and he knew with a chilling certainty that the desert would simply absorb the sound without a trace, as if he had never been there at all. His first instinct was a primal, childish impulse to run. He could run west, chase the faint tracks in the dust, and somehow catch her. He could beg, plead, promise they would be no trouble, anything to reverse the last 10 minutes. The thought was a brief, desperate fantasy, a flickering candle against a hurricane of reality. He looked back at the western horizon, already a shimmering, indistinct line of heat. It had taken 6 hours by wagon to get here. 6 hours. The absurdity of the idea was a splash of cold water, just as shocking as the buckets Constance had used that morning. There was no going back. The path to Tucson was a path to a slower, more agonizing death by exhaustion, a futile pilgrimage toward a door that had been bolted and barred against them forever. The realization settled not as a thought, but as a physical sensation, a leaden weight in his stomach that anchored him to this terrible new present. With the fantasy of retreat shattered, the full, crushing weight of despair descended. It was a tangible force pulling at his shoulders, urging him to his knees. He felt the sting of tears welling behind his eyes, a hot, bitter flood of rage, fear, and profound loneliness. He wanted to curl into a ball, to shut his eyes and let the sun and the silence do their work. It would be easy, so much easier than facing the impossible task ahead. He could simply stop, and the struggle would be over. The temptation was a siren's song in the roaring quiet of his mind, but then a small, trembling hand slid into his. He looked down and saw Ruth, her face pale and streaked with dust, her eyes wide with a terror that was a perfect mirror of his own. She wasn't looking at the empty horizon. She was looking at him. In her gaze, he saw not an accusation but a question, a plea, and he knew in that instant that he was not allowed the luxury of his own despair. That small point of contact, the feeling of his sister's hand in his, was the fulcrum on which his entire world turned. The boy who wanted to give up died in that moment, and in his place something else began to form. It was not courage, not yet. It was a harder, colder thing. Resolve. He was the oldest. He was all they had. His collapse would be their collapse. His surrender would be their death sentence. The choice was not between living and dying, but between fighting and surrendering. Constance had left them to the judgment of God, and Elijah decided then and there that he would not face that judgment on his knees. He would face it on his feet, walking east. The decision was not a thought, but a spark that ignited in the cold ashes of his fear, a sudden, fierce blaze of duty that burned away the tears before they could fall. His mind, which had been a whirlwind of panic, suddenly became unnervingly calm, a tool to be used. He began a mental inventory, not of what they had, but of what he knew. His mother's voice, a ghost he had clung to in the dark of their locked room, now became a vital presence in the blinding light of the desert. He saw her hands, showing him how to read the ribs of a saguaro for water. He heard her explaining how the shade of a palo verde tree was always cooler. He recalled her stories of animals not as children's fables, but as lessons in survival. "Watch the hawk," she had said, "for it sees the things hidden from the ground. Listen to the coyote, for it knows the secret paths." These fragments of memory, once just comforting echoes of a lost love, now assembled themselves in his mind into a rudimentary map, a set of instructions for staying alive. It was the only inheritance he had left, and he clung to it with a desperate intensity. He then made a physical assessment of their meager resources. He uncapped his canteen, tilting it to gauge the weight of the water inside. Less than half full. He did the same for Ruth's and Samuel's. The water was already warm, a tepid, sloshing reminder of how little time they had. 3 half-full canteens against the furnace of the Sonoran sun. He looked at their clothes, thin cotton shirts and worn trousers. He looked at their boots, sturdy enough for town streets, but pitifully inadequate for the miles of rock and thorn that lay ahead. The accounting was bleak, a stark and brutal equation that pointed overwhelmingly toward failure. But the act of assessing, of treating their situation like a problem to be solved rather than a fate to be endured, was in itself an act of defiance. It was a declaration that he would not be a passive victim. He would manage their decline, conserve every drop, and fight for every single step. Elijah knew he had to become their leader, and a leader could not show fear. He forced his face into a mask of calm determination, a facade he prayed they would believe. He knelt down in front of Samuel, whose small body was trembling uncontrollably, and looked him directly in the eye. He didn't offer false promises of a short journey or an easy walk. He simply said, with a quiet authority he didn't know he possessed, that they were going to walk together and that he would not leave them behind. He was performing a role, acting the part of the protector he needed to be, and in doing so, he found a sliver of that strength becoming real within him. He was building a shelter for them, not of wood or stone, but of his own will, a fragile barrier against the overwhelming terror of their reality. Finally, there was nothing left to do but begin. The point of no return had not been when the wagon disappeared, but this moment right now, as he made the conscious choice to act. He stood up, took Ruth's hand firmly in his left, and then reached down to take Samuel's in his right. He formed a chain, a small, vulnerable unit of 3 bound together against the vastness. He took one last look at the place where Constance had abandoned them, a silent farewell to the boy he had been and the life he had known. Then he turned his face to the east, toward the direction she had pointed, toward the shimmering, hostile horizon that held their only infinitesimal chance of survival. With a deep breath that felt like drawing fire into his lungs, he took the first step. The journey to the hidden spring had begun. The first steps were the hardest, a deliberate act of rebellion against the paralysis of shock. With his sister's hand clutched in his left and his brother's in his right, Elijah forced his legs to move. The motion felt alien, a clumsy shuffle through the fine dust that rose in miniature clouds around their worn boots. The sun, still low on the eastern horizon, was a deceptively gentle warmth on his back, but he knew what it would become. He felt the vast, crushing silence of the desert settle over them, a silence so complete it felt like a sound in itself, the hum of an indifferent universe. He focused on the simple mechanics of walking, placing one foot in front of the other, establishing a rhythm that was less a pace and more a funereal march. He set his jaw, refusing to look back, because looking back meant acknowledging the finality of what had just happened. The only direction that mattered now was forward, into the shimmering, hostile emptiness that Constance had chosen as their grave. With each passing hour, the sun climbed higher, transforming from a distant star into a malevolent white-hot eye in the sky. It leached the color from the landscape, bleaching the pale greens of the cacti to a dusty gray, and turning the sand into a blinding reflective surface. The heat was no longer a gentle warmth, it was a physical weight, pressing down on their heads and shoulders, making the air thick and difficult to draw into their lungs. The water in their canteens, once cool, was now tepid, almost hot, and each sip felt less like refreshment and more like a desperate, insufficient measure against the inevitable. Elijah could feel the sweat trickling down his spine, a futile attempt by his body to cool itself. The desert was not just an environment. It was an active adversary, its primary weapon a relentless, suffocating heat that sought to bake the life right out of them. Ruth walked beside him in a state of muted shock, her small hand a constant, trembling presence in his. The initial, terrified sobs that had shaken her small frame when the wagon disappeared had subsided into a frightening, unnatural quiet. She moved with a mechanical, shuffling gait, her eyes fixed on the ground just ahead of her feet, as if the vastness of the horizon was too much to bear. She did not speak, did not complain. Her silence was more unnerving to Elijah than any cry would have been. It was the silence of a spirit beginning to retreat, to wall itself off from a reality that was too monstrous to process. He would squeeze her hand every few minutes, a small, desperate signal of reassurance, and she would squeeze back weakly. A flicker of connection in the overwhelming isolation. They were a three-person island in an ocean of sand, and her silence was the first sign that the tide was rising around them. Samuel, at only 6 years old, was the first to falter. His short legs, so full of energy in the yard back home, were no match for the uneven, unforgiving terrain. He stumbled frequently, his small cries of frustration growing weaker with each fall. Within the first 2 hours he was lagging, his pace slowing to a painful crawl. Elijah knew that forcing him to walk would only exhaust him faster. Without a word he stopped, knelt down, and motioned for Samuel to climb onto his back. The boy wrapped his arms around Elijah's neck, his small body surprisingly heavy, a dead weight that settled onto Elijah's already weary shoulders. The added burden was immense, a constant physical reminder of the responsibility he carried. He adjusted the load, squared his shoulders, and resumed the march, his own fatigue now doubled, his every step a battle against gravity and the crushing weight of his brother's survival. The desert floor was a treacherous obstacle course, a far cry from the flat, packed dirt roads they were used to. The ground was a mosaic of loose rock that shifted under their feet, threatening to twist an ankle with every step, and patches of sun-baked earth as hard as stone. Thorny bushes, their branches like skeletal claws, snagged at their clothes, tearing small rips in the thin cotton. The spines of cholla cacti, scattered across the ground like deadly caltrops, seemed to leap out at them, and Elijah had to carefully steer them around the most dangerous patches, his eyes constantly scanning the ground. He remembered his mother telling him to walk where the lizards walk, on the harder, more stable ground. He tried to follow that advice, searching for the faintest signs of animal trails, using her remembered wisdom as a compass to guide them through the immediate physical dangers of their path, a small act of navigation in a world where they were utterly lost. After what felt like a lifetime, but was likely only 3 hours, Elijah called a halt. He found the meager shade of a skeletal palo verde tree, a dappled and insufficient relief from the direct assault of the sun. It was time for their first water ration. The moment felt solemn, a critical procedure upon which everything depended. He uncapped Samuel's canteen first, giving the boy 3 slow, deliberate sips, counting them out loud. Samuel's eyes pleaded for more, but Elijah shook his head, his face a mask of grim resolve. He then gave Ruth the same amount, before taking 3 sips for himself. The warm, metallic-tasting water did little to quench his thirst, but it was a temporary reprieve. He capped the canteens tightly, the sound of the metal lids screwing shut echoing the finality of his decision. He was the keeper of their lifeblood, and the dwindling supply was a constant, terrifying calculus in the back of his mind. As the sun reached its zenith directly overhead, the heat intensified into a brutal physical force that felt like standing too close to a blacksmith's forge. The air shimmered, distorting the horizon into a wavering, watery line. For a moment, the sheer, hopeless scale of their predicament crashed down on Elijah with the force of a physical blow. They were a microscopic speck in an endless, hostile wilderness, with no food, dwindling water, and no real destination other than a vague direction given by the woman who wanted them dead. Despair, cold and sharp, pierced through his carefully constructed resolve. He felt his knees weaken, the urge to simply lie down and let the desert claim them, a powerful, seductive whisper in his mind. The weight of his siblings, both literal and metaphorical, felt unbearable. It was a fleeting but terrifying moment of surrender, a glimpse into the abyss of hopelessness that lay just beneath the surface of his determination. They were skirting a small, rocky outcrop when a sound stopped them dead in their tracks. It was a sharp, dry, buzzing rattle, a sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the primal core of the brain. Elijah froze, his hand tightening on Ruth's, his body a rigid statue. Not 10 feet away, coiled in the sliver of shade cast by a boulder, was a western diamondback rattlesnake. Its head was raised, its tail a blur of motion, its black, unblinking eyes fixed directly on them. Time seemed to stop. The oppressive heat, the thirst, the exhaustion, all of it vanished, replaced by a single needlepoint of pure, undiluted terror. He knew any sudden movement could provoke a strike. He stood perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs, and slowly, carefully, began to back away, pulling a petrified Ruth with him. The snake watched them for a long, tense moment. Then, as if deciding they were not worth the effort, it uncoiled and slithered silently away into a crack in the rocks. They were safe, but the encounter left them trembling, a stark reminder that the desert's threats were not just passive, but active, alive, and deadly. The afternoon devolved into a grueling, monotonous rhythm of pure endurance. The brief adrenaline from the snake encounter faded, leaving behind a deeper, more profound exhaustion. Elijah continued to carry Samuel, whose small body was now slick with sweat, his breathing shallow. The world shrank to the few feet of ground in front of him. The focus was no longer on the horizon, but on the next step and the one after that. Left foot, right foot. Breathe in, breathe out. It was a walking meditation of misery. He could feel blisters forming on his heels, a sharp stinging pain with every step. His own thirst was a raging fire in his throat, a constant, agonizing sensation that he had to ignore. He was no longer a boy. He was a machine, a simple organism whose sole purpose was forward motion, driven by the quiet, desperate whimpers of his siblings and the fading echo of a promise he had made to himself. The horizon became a cruel, taunting illusion. No matter how far they walked, it remained impossibly distant, a shimmering line of heat that seemed to recede with every step they took toward it. The landscape, which had seemed varied at first, now blurred into a repeating pattern of sand, rock, and skeletal brush. There were no landmarks to measure their progress, no sense of accomplishment to fuel their morale. It felt as if they were walking on a giant treadmill, putting forth immense effort, only to remain in the same desolate place. This psychological toll was almost as damaging as the physical one. The lack of visible progress ate away at their hope, creating a profound sense of disorientation and futility. Elijah had to fight not just the desert, but the despair that grew from this feeling of being trapped in an endless, unchanging panorama of desolation. As the sun finally began its descent, painting the western sky in spectacular, mocking hues of orange, purple, and red, a wave of relief washed over them. The temperature dropped with surprising speed, the oppressive heat of the day giving way to a cool, blessed breeze. They collapsed onto the sand, their bodies too exhausted to move another inch. For a few precious moments, they could breathe without the air searing their lungs. The beauty of the sunset was a strange, painful contrast to the ugliness of their situation. But this reprieve was short-lived. As the last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon, the coolness became a biting cold. The desert, having failed to bake them to death, now seemed intent on freezing them. The sweat on their clothes turned icy against their skin, and a deep, uncontrollable shivering began to rack their bodies. The night was a new kind of ordeal. The vast, empty sky, once a source of oppressive light, was now a black, star-dusted blanket that offered no warmth. The cold was a penetrating, insidious thing that seeped into their bones. They had no fire, no blankets, nothing but their own thin shirts to protect them from the plummeting temperature. Elijah pulled Ruth and Samuel close, creating a small, shivering huddle of humanity in the immense darkness. He wrapped his arms around them, trying to share his own meager body heat. But it felt like trying to warm a glacier with a single candle. The desert was not quiet at night. It was alive with strange, unsettling sounds, the distant yip of a coyote, the screech of some unseen nightbird, the rustle of small creatures in the brush. Every sound was magnified in the darkness, stoking the fires of their fear and making sleep an impossibility. By the first light of dawn on the second day, the defining feature of their existence was thirst. The canteens were almost empty. Elijah made the final, agonizing decision. He poured the last few precious drops of water from his own canteen into Samuel's, then tipped it into the boy's mouth. He watched his little brother swallow, his own throat a dry, cracked wasteland. He gave the last of Ruth's water to her. The act was a final, desperate gamble. He knew that without water their time was now measured in hours, not days. The feeling of the empty, weightless canteens hanging at his side was a new and profound form of dread, a physical manifestation of their complete and utter destitution. The last buffer between them and the desert was gone. From this moment on, They were running on nothing but the rapidly dwindling reserves of their own bodies. The second day was a descent into a waking nightmare. Ruth's fever, which had been a low-grade heat the day before, now raged. Her skin was scorching to the touch, and her eyes, when they were open, were glassy and unfocused. She began to stumble constantly, her legs no longer obeying her commands. Worse, she started to talk, her voice a dry, raspy whisper. She was speaking to their mother, her words a jumbled, hallucinatory conversation. She would point to the empty air beside her and say, "Mama, look at the pretty flowers." Elijah's heart broke with every word. He had to loop his arm around her waist, half carrying, half dragging her forward. He was now trying to propel the weight of 2 other people across the desert, his own strength fading with every agonizing step. Not long after noon, Samuel stopped crying. The change was terrifying. For hours, his weak, dehydrated sobs had been a constant, miserable soundtrack to their journey. Now there was only silence. He went limp in Elijah's arms, his head lolling against his brother's shoulder, his small body too depleted to even produce tears. His breathing was shallow, his lips pale and cracked. Elijah gently shook him, calling his name, but received no response. This was the moment the abstract concept of death became a real and immediate presence. It was no longer a vague threat on the horizon. It was here, in his arms, slowly claiming his little brother. A surge of desperate, primal energy flooded Elijah's system. He could not let Samuel die. He hitched his brother higher on his chest, tightened his grip on Ruth, and pushed forward with a renewed, frantic urgency. Elijah's world had contracted to a blur of pain and motion. The sun was a dull, hazy orb in a bleached white sky. His own body was a symphony of agony. His head throbbed, his muscles screamed, and his cracked lips bled with every ragged breath. He walked on autopilot, his consciousness flickering. He carried Samuel and dragged Ruth, his small frame straining under the impossible load. In the haze of his delirium, he began to whisper the prayers his mother had taught him. They weren't pleas for a miracle, they were just words, fragments of memory that he clung to, a mantra to keep his feet moving when his body had already given up. He was a vessel of pure will, a ghost haunting the desert, fueled by the last, flickering embers of a promise to protect his family. One more step, just one more step. The terrain shifted, becoming a series of low, sun-scorched rock formations and hills, a final, cruel obstacle course designed to break him. He stumbled on a loose rock, his ankle twisting, sending a searing bolt of pain up his leg. He fell to his knees, the impact jarring his teeth, Samuel's limp body tumbling from his arms. He lay there for a moment, the hot ground burning his cheek, the will to get up completely gone. This was it. This was the end. He could just stay here, lie down with his siblings, and let the silence take them. It would be so easy. The thought was a sweet, tempting poison. He closed his eyes, ready to surrender to the inevitable, to finally rest. But as he lay there, his vision swimming, something caught his eye. Just beyond the rock that had tripped him, nestled at the base of a larger formation, was a thicket of creosote bushes. They were unremarkable in every way but one. Their leaves were a slightly deeper, healthier shade of green than the desiccated olive-drab brush surrounding them. It was an almost imperceptible difference, a detail that his delirious mind should have missed. Yet in that moment, another one of his mother's lessons surfaced from the depths of his memory, a faint whisper across time. "Life," she had said, "always crowds around water, no matter how hidden." That small patch of impossible green was a sign. It was a word in the language of the desert he had been taught to read. It wasn't a promise, but it was a possibility. With a groan that was more animal than human, he pushed himself back to his feet, a final, desperate surge of hope kindled by a single, subtle shade of green. He pushed through the wall of creosote with the last dregs of a strength he did not possess. The branches, tougher and more vibrant than any they had passed, scratched at his arms and face, leaving thin red lines on his sunburnt skin. The air here was different, thick with the sharp, resinous smell of the plant, a scent of rain that felt like a cruel mockery in the bone-dry heat. He half-dragged, half-carried Ruth, her feverish weight, a leaden anchor, while Samuel remained a terrifyingly still burden in his arms. The memory of his mother's voice was the only thing keeping him upright, a ghostly whisper, promising that life clustered around hidden water. He was moving on pure faith, a blind pilgrimage toward a speck of green in a world of brown, when his foot caught on an exposed root. He pitched forward, a strangled cry escaping his lips as he fought to keep from crushing Samuel beneath him, landing hard on his hands and knees on a slab of dark, cool stone. The shock of the impact was secondary to the sensation that shot through his palms. The rock beneath him was not just cool, it was damp. It was an impossible feeling, a contradiction to the baked, scorching reality of the last 48 hours. His delirious mind struggled to process the input. He lifted a trembling hand, staring at the dark, wet imprint it left behind. His eyes followed the moisture up the face of the rock to a narrow, vertical crack, no wider than his finger. From this fissure, a single, perfect bead of water emerged, glistened for a moment in the filtered sunlight, and then traced a slow silver path down the stone. Below it another drop formed, and then another. It was a sight so miraculous, so fundamentally impossible, that for a long moment he could only stare, his parched throat unable to form a sound. It was the earth itself, weeping life into the heart of desolation. His first coherent thought was not for himself. It was for Samuel. With a surge of adrenaline that momentarily erased his own agony, he gently laid his brother down on the stone slab. Samuel's eyes were closed, his chest rising and falling in shallow, almost imperceptible breaths. Elijah ignored the small cupped pool at the base of the rock. It seemed too precious, too sacred to disturb. Instead, he pressed his palms against the weeping fissure, collecting the cool water in his cupped hands. The liquid felt impossibly cold, a shock of life against his own feverish skin. He turned and carefully brought his hands to Samuel's mouth, tilting them so a small trickle of water flowed over his brother's cracked, pale lips. He watched, his own breath held tight in his chest as the boy's throat worked, a faint, instinctual swallow that was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. He repeated the process again and again, a slow, patient ritual of survival. After the fourth offering of water, Samuel's eyelids fluttered. A soft moan escaped his lips and he stirred, his small body shifting on the hard stone. It was the first voluntary movement he had made in hours. The flicker of life, so close to being extinguished, was being coaxed back from the brink. A wave of relief so powerful it made Elijah's knees weak washed over him. He had not failed. He had not let his little brother die in his arms. The small victory was monumental, a single point of light pushing back an oppressive, overwhelming darkness. He could see the faintest hint of color returning to Samuel's cheeks, a fragile bloom of life in the barren wasteland that had almost claimed them. The desert had not won. Not yet. Next was Ruth. He helped her to her knees, guiding her head toward the small basin where the steady drip, drip, drip from the fissure had collected into a shallow, impossible pool. The water was crystalline, reflecting the sliver of blue sky visible through the rocks above. Ruth, in her fevered delirium, seemed to barely comprehend what was happening, but her body understood. She plunged her face into the pool with a guttural gasp, drinking with a frantic, desperate thirst that was painful to watch. The cool water spilled down her chin, washing away the dust and grime, carving clean paths through the dirt on her neck. He watched as the frantic tension in her small frame began to ease, her feverish skin already seeming less flushed under the life-giving touch of the water. He could hear the sound of her survival, a raw and primal symphony of gulping breaths and splashing water. He finally allowed himself to take in their surroundings. They were in a small, shaded alcove, a natural grotto formed by two massive, leaning slabs of granite that almost touched at the top, creating a protective roof against the relentless sun. The temperature here was at least 20 degrees cooler than the exposed desert just a few feet away. The air was still and quiet, the only sound the gentle, rhythmic bubbling of the spring as it seeped from the rock. It was a sanctuary, a hidden pocket of existence where the brutal laws of the desert did not apply. For the first time since Constance had driven away, he felt a sliver of safety. The oppressive, agoraphobic vastness of the wilderness was gone, replaced by the comforting, enclosed security of this small, sacred space. They were hidden, shielded, and for the moment, they were safe. Only then did Elijah allow himself to drink. He knelt beside his sister, lowered his head to the pool and drank with a thirst so profound it felt as if he were trying to drain an ocean. The water was cold and clean, with a faint mineral taste of the rock from which it was born. It was not just a liquid, it was a balm, a medicine. He could feel it coursing through his system, extinguishing the fire in his throat, rehydrating his parched tissues, and clearing the hazy fog of exhaustion from his mind. He drank until his stomach ached, then pulled back, gasping, his face dripping, the water plastering his dusty hair to his forehead. He felt like a man reborn, baptized in the heart of the furnace that was meant to be his tomb. The simple biological act of quenching his thirst was an experience of overwhelming spiritual significance. He sat back on the cool, damp stone, his body trembling with the aftershocks of their ordeal. Ruth had curled up beside the pool, her thirst sated, and had already fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep. Samuel, too, was breathing more deeply, his small form curled into a ball near the entrance of their rocky haven. The constant, desperate needs that had driven Elijah forward for 2 days, the thirst, the fear, the heat, had all been answered. The silence that now settled in the grotto was not the predatory silence of the open desert, but a peaceful, restorative quiet. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he was not a protector, not a leader, not a beast of burden. He was just a 13-year-old boy who had managed against all odds to keep his family alive. And that was when the strength that had held him together finally broke. The rigid column of will that had supported him across miles of sun-scorched earth simply dissolved, and the full, crushing weight of the last 2 days descended upon him. A single, silent sob tore up from the very depths of his soul, a release of terror and gratitude so profound it felt like shattering. His 13-year-old body, pushed beyond every known limit of endurance, was racked with violent, silent tremors. Tears he had refused to shed streamed down his face, mixing with the water from the spring, carving clean rivulets through the layers of dust and grime. He wept for his mother and father, for the home they had lost, for the cruelty of the woman who had left them to die, and for the unbelievable, miraculous fact that they were still alive. Through the blur of his tears he looked up, past the opening of their stone shelter, to the sliver of brilliant blue sky. High above, a dark shape circled on the thermal currents. It was the hawk. It was still there, a silent, solitary sentinel keeping watch. And in that moment, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with breathtaking clarity. He had not found this place by accident. He had not stumbled upon it through sheer luck. He had been led here. The hawk, the green creosote, the impossible spring. It was all a message, a map left for him not on paper, but in the living language of the world. It was his mother's lesson, made real. The knowledge she had given him was not just a collection of comforting stories, it was a real, tangible inheritance, a key that had just unlocked the door to their survival. He reached out a trembling hand and laid it flat against the damp rock face, feeling the cool, steady pulse of the water seeping through the stone. This was the proof. This hidden spring was the evidence that his mother's love had not vanished with her death. It had remained, embedded in the world she understood so well, waiting for him to find it. Constance had left them with nothing but a death sentence, but his mother had left them with everything they needed. The realization settled over him, quieting the storm of his sobs and replacing it with a profound, bone-deep sense of peace. He was exhausted, broken and grieving, but for the first time in a very long time he did not feel alone. He felt watched over, protected by a love that was as persistent and life-giving as the water that flowed from the unyielding rock. The tears that streamed down Elijah's face were not the hot, bitter tears of grief he had known before, but a cool, cleansing flood, mingling with the life-giving water of the spring. Each sob that racked his exhausted frame was not a sign of collapse, but an act of release, the shedding of a skin of terror that had encased him for 2 days. He was letting go of the boy who had been abandoned in the dust, the boy who had walked through the furnace of hell, and the boy who had been certain he was about to watch his family perish. He cried until his lungs ached and his vision blurred, the sound of his weeping absorbed by the damp stone and the gentle, persistent bubbling of the water. In the safety of this hidden grotto, shielded from the sun and the vast, killing emptiness of the desert, he finally allowed himself to be 13 years old again. A child who had been pushed far beyond the limits of what any child should ever endure, and had somehow impossibly survived. As the storm of emotion began to subside, leaving him trembling and hollowed out, a new kind of awareness started to dawn. It was a thought that began not in his mind, but as a feeling, a deep, resonant hum of understanding that rose from the very stones beneath him. He looked from his sleeping siblings, their chests rising and falling in the steady, peaceful rhythm of true rest, to the fissure in the rock, still weeping its miraculous tears. This was not luck. The word felt cheap, inadequate, an insult to the sheer orchestrated improbability of their survival. Luck was finding a dropped coin on a dusty street. This was something else entirely. This was a design, a carefully laid path he had been too blind with fear and exhaustion to see while he was walking it, but which now, in the aftermath, revealed itself with the stark clarity of a map unrolled in the sun. He thought of the hawk. It had not just been a bird circling in the sky. It had been a signpost, a living arrow pointing the way. He remembered the specific shade of green on the creosote bushes, a vibrant, impossible color that had snagged his attention even in his delirium. That, too, was a marker. And then there was the final, crucial piece, the memory of his mother's voice, surfacing from the depths of his mind at the precise moment he was ready to surrender. God speaks through his creatures to those who pay attention. It hadn't been a random recollection. It had been a key turning in a lock. These were not disconnected events. They were a sequence, a language, a message sent across the veil of death itself, a message he had been taught to read his entire life without ever knowing when the final critical test would come. The true nature of his inheritance slammed into him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him breathless. Constance's inheritance was a house, a bank account, a collection of material things she had valued so much she was willing to murder for them. She had used that inheritance to purchase their death sentence, to buy a wagon and canteens and drive them into the wilderness. But his mother, Sarah, had left him something far more valuable. Her inheritance was not something you could hold or count. It was the knowledge of the hawk's flight, the meaning of a plant's color, the faith to look for water where there should be none. While Constance had given them the tools for their destruction, his mother had given them the wisdom for their salvation. The contrast was so profound, so absolute, it felt like the final, irrefutable judgment in a cosmic trial between good and evil. A new wave of tears came, but these were different. They were quiet, born of a gratitude so immense it had no sound. He reached out and touched the damp rock, feeling the cool, steady life pulsing within it. This spring was the physical proof of his mother's love. It was a love that had not ended with her last breath. It had been woven into the stories she told, embedded in the lessons she taught, and left waiting in the world for him to find. It was a love that had anticipated a need he could never have imagined, a protective force that had reached across time and oblivion to guide her son's feet. He was not an orphan abandoned to the whims of a cruel universe. He was the keeper of a legacy, the recipient of a love so powerful it could make water flow from stone. The understanding settled into his soul, healing the raw, ragged edges of his grief and filling the hollow spaces with a quiet, unshakable strength. He looked at Ruth, her face now relaxed in sleep, the fever flush receding. He looked at Samuel, curled into a ball, his breathing deep and even. He had done it. He had kept them safe. But he knew now that he had not done it alone. He had been a vessel, the hands and feet for a plan much larger than his own. Every lesson from his mother, every story, every piece of desert lore he had stored away as a child's curiosity, had been a tool being placed in his hands for this exact moment. The realization did not diminish his own effort. It sanctified it. It transformed their brutal, agonizing journey from a desperate flight from death into a sacred pilgrimage toward a hidden sanctuary that had been prepared for them all along. The desert was no longer his enemy. It was the canvas upon which his mother had painted their map to survival. He felt a sudden, powerful need to speak to her. He leaned his forehead against the cool, wet rock, the water trickling over his skin like a benediction. He closed his eyes and whispered the words into the stone, his voice a raw, broken thing. "I heard you, Mama. I listened. Thank you." The words were simple, inadequate, but they carried the entire weight of his journey, of his fear, and of his monumental, soul-shattering relief. He stayed there for a long time, letting the silence and the rhythmic drip of the spring answer him. He felt her presence not as a ghostly apparition, but as a profound and comforting peace, a certainty that her love was as real and as persistent as the water that had saved their lives. In the heart of the Sonoran Desert, in a place that should have been their tomb, Elijah Miller finally understood that he had never, for one single moment, been truly alone. For the next 3 weeks, the hidden spring became their entire world, a pocket of life and safety carved out of the surrounding desolation. The initial, desperate relief slowly gave way to a quiet routine of survival, each action guided by the resurrected wisdom of his mother. Elijah taught himself to fashion snares from the fibrous strands of yucca plants, catching the small rabbits and lizards that were drawn to the water source. He recognized the sweet, edible fruit of the prickly pear cactus, carefully burning off the spines in a small controlled fire, just as she had shown him. They lived as the desert lived, in accordance with its harsh but predictable rhythms. In this crucible of self-reliance, Elijah's grief for his mother transformed into a deep, working partnership with her memory. He was no longer just her son, he was her student, finally putting her most vital lessons into practice, and with each small success he felt her quiet pride. Their rescue came not as a sudden, dramatic event, but as a gentle intrusion into their new, isolated reality. A group of Mexican vaqueros, driving a small herd of cattle through the rugged terrain, had been led astray by a sudden dust storm. Their leader, a man named Don Miguel Salazar, with a face as weathered and kind as the landscape itself, had sent his best tracker to search for any sign of water. The tracker, following the same subtle signs that had guided Elijah, found his way to the grotto. The sight of the 3 children, thin and sun-worn but very much alive, was a vision so unexpected it moved the stoic cattleman to stunned silence. They were not seen as vagrants or unfortunate orphans, but as a miracle, a testament to a resilience the desert men understood and deeply respected. Their ordeal was over, and they were gently, carefully brought back into the world of men. The story of the Miller children's abandonment and survival spread like a brushfire through Tucson, a tale of monstrous cruelty and incredible fortitude. The sheriff, armed with Elijah's clear, unwavering testimony, reopened investigations into Constance Harlow's past. The truth that emerged was darker than anyone had imagined. The bodies of 2 other stepchildren from a previous marriage were unearthed on a property she owned in Phoenix, their small skeletons telling a silent, horrific story of greed and convenience. Constance's facade of the respectable widow was utterly destroyed, revealing the sociopath beneath. Her trial was swift, her conviction absolute. Justice, when it finally came, was as stark and final as the desert itself. She was hanged in the public square, her name becoming a local byword for a kind of evil that defied all human comprehension. But the children's story did not end with justice. It began anew with grace. Don Miguel and his wife, Doña Esperanza Salazar, a couple whose own children had been taken by the same cholera epidemic that had claimed Sarah Miller, saw in Elijah, Ruth, and Samuel not a burden, but a gift. They saw a reflection of their own loss and an opportunity for a love that had been left without a home. They opened their sprawling, vibrant hacienda and their hearts to the 3 orphans, adopting them without hesitation. For the first time in almost a year, the Miller children slept in soft beds, ate until they were full, and were surrounded not by the cold silence of neglect, but by the warm, bustling sounds of a true and loving family. They had been given a second chance not just at life, but at a childhood. The desert, which had been the theater of their greatest trial, never became a place of fear for Elijah. Instead, it became his sanctuary, his teacher, his life's work. He spent his years learning its secrets from Don Miguel and the vaqueros, his mother's initial lessons blossoming into an unparalleled expertise. He became a renowned guide, a man who could read the land as others read a book. Over a lifetime, He led 17 lost travelers out of the wilderness, saving them from the same fate he had so narrowly escaped. And the first place he always took them, the first stop on their journey back to life, was the small hidden spring he had named Ruth's Well, a tribute to the sister whose fever had been the driving force behind his desperate search. The legacy of Sarah Miller's love, proven in the heart of the desert, rippled outward through her children's lives. Ruth, who had been brought back from the brink by the cool, clear water, dedicated her life to nurturing young minds. She became a beloved teacher at the Mission San Xavier del Bac, her classroom a place of patience, kindness, and unwavering belief in the potential of every child. Samuel, who had been a silent, limp weight in his brother's arms, never forgot the feeling of being utterly helpless and abandoned. He was ordained as a priest, and he devoted his ministry to establishing orphanages and safe houses across the territory, becoming a fierce and tireless advocate for the very children the world was most eager to forget. Elijah Miller lived to be an old man, his face a map of sun and wind, his eyes holding the quiet wisdom of one who had stared into the abyss and found it was not empty. He would often return to Ruth's Well alone, sitting on the same cool stone where he had collapsed as a boy. He would listen to the steady, rhythmic pulse of the water seeping from the rock, a sound that had become the enduring heartbeat of his life. It was a reminder that even in the most barren and desolate of places, love could leave a mark. It could create a sanctuary. It could flow, persistent and life-giving, long after the world believed it was gone, a quiet miracle waiting for those with the faith and the knowledge to find it.